Okay, hopefully this won't be too long. I think I'm just going to talk about one book written by this young woman. It was her last published book. She died at age 36, outliving her sisters, outliving her brother, outliving a lot of people. Actually, I think they might have even had, the family might have even had more children. Um, but she is Charlotte Bronte, the author of Villette. And I've read her previous novels, which are kind of important to talk about at this point too, because her first novel was called The Professor. Was not published until after she passed away. It was I've talked about this before. She and her two sisters, Charlotte and no, she's Charlotte. Her sisters Anne and Emily had each written a novel. Anne had written Charlotte. What's it called? Oh man, I don't remember Anne's first novel. It's named after a woman, Agnes Grey. And Emily, of course, wrote her only novel, Wuthering Heights, classic, universally acknowledged classic. Charlotte wrote a novel called The Professor, based on her time, her and Emily's time as a teacher in a town in Brussels, in the town of Brussels, in across the channel from where they lived in England. This is I've always thought this is a very interesting thing. I would like to know more about Charlotte's background and how this affected her. But at the time, the both Agnes Grey, the novel Agnes Grey, and Wuthering Heights were accepted, but her novel, The Professor, was rejected by the publisher. So she had to deal with right out of the gate her two younger sisters having their novels go into print while hers was rejected. She'd eventually get her revenge. Not that you would call it revenge, really, but because she went on to write her next novel, which is her masterpiece, and probably the masterpiece, the way most people feel about it, probably the masterpiece of the whole period. Jane Eyre, and I can't believe I had to pause to look up the name Jane Eyre, but just like I've said in every video, every name flies out of my head as soon as I start doing a video. So that's why I've got the Wikipedia page up for Villette so that I won't get character names wrong. Although I'm not going to talk about that many. Anyway, so she wrote Jane Eyre, one of the most famous novels of the 19th century. Um, and these are pre-Victorian novels because they came out before Queen Victoria was on the throne. Um, then she wrote a novel called Shirley, which and I love Jane Eyre very much. I'll touch on that in a moment because there's some similarity to Villette. There's a lot of similarity to The Professor, which I'll get to. A lot of some similarity to Jane Eyre, at least in my opinion. And then she wrote a novel called Shirley, which is the name of the main protagonist of the novel. The book didn't really do much for me. It was a historical novel. It had a lot to do with economics and property and things of the time. I didn't really get it very well. So I would say that's the weakest of her books. And looking up, I don't think it's ever been adapted into a BBC thing or anything like that. But I did read it. And then her final novel, which probably, what I've been thinking about a lot lately is because I've been reading a lot of Robert Howard. Is how do you talk about a person's career when they die so ridiculously young? All the Brontes died very young. Charlotte Bronte was 36, probably was in, well into her writing career. Probably would have kept writing novels for another 30 years if she lived. Um, so it's different, I think, to talk about a person who died at these incredibly young ages. Of course, there was many of them at the time. Maybe Jane Eyre would still be her most popular novel, just like Mary Shelley went on to write a bunch of other stuff. But Frankenstein's by far her most popular work, her first work when she was just out of her teens or in her teens, maybe. Anyway, I'm getting way too off track, which I know some of you like. And but anyway, then we come to Villette, which is not. Oh, I wanted to say about Shirley. It's just an interesting fact about the novel that it's about a young woman named Shirley. However, that at the time was a man's name, a man's first name. Her father, the character's father, just happened to like it and named her that. And now, so the novel had definitely that influence, at least, that people started naming girls Shirley instead of sons. And it's very hard to even think of a man named Shirley at this. I can't think of anyone. Anyway, then her final book was Villette, which was written in 1853. The protagonist is Lucy Snow, who tells it in the first person. Um, and it's a very good novel. It's a very deep novel. It it reminds me of the time. I mean, a lot of older novels do, but she wrote it the way she wanted to write it, which I think is interesting in the moment we live in. At least what I see on YouTube and things, and when I see critics talk about movies or books or whatever, there's just really this concept of genre expectations and formulas, and how do we get everything, and thinking about the audience once and everything. And people didn't used to write like that. At least not everyone did. Some people certainly figured it out, knew how to become popular with an audience, but this is not the way she wrote this book, in my opinion. Not that she didn't want it to sell or anything like this, but it's really her own structure. I mean, it's similar to other novels in some ways, but there's choices she makes. There's parts of the story that she just decided this is how I'm going to tell it, which I found very interesting because you don't really know where it's going to go, and there are things that are a bit similar to Jane Eyre. When I read that book, I was quite surprised to find the first half of the book isn't really anything involved with the story of Jane Eyre that we know from adaptations, which is about her marriage to Rochester and his weird past, and the mad woman in the attic, to coin a phrase, to borrow the phrase from the famous book about the. I'm sorry. Earlier, I said this was not a Victorian novel. What I meant to say was this is an earlier Victorian novel. It's early in the reign of Queen Victoria, not who had a very long reign. But anyway, forget that. I'm not a scholar anyway. But this is a Victorian novel, and I'm adjusting my mic. See, I have all these technical problems now that I decided to try and make my videos at least audible and better looking. Faceless said I lost weight, and actually I thought I had, but you know what I think it really is? It's just I'm using the phone, which is a better camera, so it's more flattering. But I think that's what really happened. Anyway, the main character is Lucy Snow, who's a first-person narrator. Who we meet her very early in her life. I think she's like, she reads older to me, but yeah, that's just a certain difference of the eras. I think she's only like 9 or 10 or 11. She gets sent to this family and stays with them for a while, and she has some adventures, and she meets some people that will be important later in her life. Well, if my face keeps getting redder, I keep stopping to cough. Better turn off the AC. Uh, so the first part takes place in the south of England, and then there's a skip of a few years, and she has some family problems that she does not discuss with us. something happens to her family. Essentially, I think she's an orphan at this point. She is sent to, or she goes to uh, meet. She goes to the town of Villette, which is based on the town of Brussels, to become a tutor and at a school. And it's where she meets some of the other characters and reconnects with some of the characters she met originally. But there's this huge gap, and at that point I stopped reading for a while. That's why it took me so long to finish this book. But because it feels like, okay, now the book's starting over. What does this preface have to do with it? It's not a preface. It's like 100 pages or so of a 700 page book. So she's starting to tell us the story of her life once she goes out on her own, but then she goes back to her home, and then she ends up in the town of Villette, which, as I said, is a stand-in for Brussels. It's in a fictional country, um, and she struggles with the French language. She meets some very strange people, uh, and I don't know if I want to go into each character or not. And a couple of men, eventually, of course, because that's what you do in these books. If you're a young lady, you meet some handsome young gentlemen, and if you're a young gentleman, you meet some fair young ladies, and uh, and mostly from that point, it's a novel of cultural differences, I guess. A lot. It's the main character Lucy is a wonderful way of describing stuff. It's just really a pleasure to read Bronte's prose, and almost at times like a travelogue. So I related to a bit, since I've been traveling the last few years. Lucy struggles with the language. She struggles with different customs. She has her romantic miscommunications, and she I don't want to get too much into spoilers, but there's some religious differences because she's whatever it would be, Church of England, Anglican, whatever, and she's very serious about it. But the men she meets are Catholic, and which is not an issue for her, and not an issue for the first man she meets, the first man she's sort of involved with, or but it is for the families, and there's a lot of pressure for her to convert and things like that. There's a lot of atmospheric stuff. There's, in fact, some ghosts that enter into it. This is a gothic feel to it. There's a really fantastic scene where the older woman who's the owner of the property, of the school, I guess, just goes into her room and searches through all her things while Lucy is asleep, but with one eye open, and it's a very kind of strange, well written sequence, pretty gothic and fanciful, because it's really not quite clear how Lucy is able to describe everything she's seeing. I think I've seen her described as an unreliable narrator. We can't really trust everything she's saying all the time, I don't think. But she has her time in this world. At the end, there's, I guess, according to what people have said, it's an ambiguous ending, but I think it's a way of the main character to avoid the sadness of relating what happens in the end. It seems pretty clear cut to me what happened, but I just found it really beautiful and really compelling all the way through, but very strange also. It's not structured entirely like a traditional novel, because it's got a big gap in the beginning. It's got a lot of information withheld about Lucy outside her outside world. What happened to her family and all that. She just chooses not to tell us that. And at the end, it really sort of drops off just before what would be the ending, then skips ahead to give a couple lines about the other women in her life and what happened to them. I mean, almost in a sense of the way to say that, look how these people's lives worked out and mine didn't, kind of thing. So it's beautifully written. I'm probably not for everybody. I mean, if you like Jane Eyre, you would definitely want to read this, I think. Um, it's not going to take the place of that, but I think it's kind of a more, it's very intense in its own way. I think it's more of a, I think it's maybe a more interesting book overall because, but not adaptable. I mean, not interesting in the way that Jane Eyre is with its sort of sort of mystery story like that. There's not as much. There's not that kind of mystery here. That's like a classic story, Jane Eyre, classically told adventure. Would spawn like 1,000 Gothics. So that's really probably what I have to say about it. I would had a big effect on me. I think just because of her voice. There is a plot. There's also a lot of diversions from the plot. There's a lot of scenes that probably don't go anywhere that are just for the joy of describing them, and that, and they would also work um, as kind of a travelogue or kind of a memoir, which it is not, because she's taking from her life, she's taking her experience on the continent as a teacher, to build this story out, and it's really like it builds out a wonderful world centered around Lucy and the people she meets. The Bronte started out as children writing their own fantasy world, kind of like Tolkien-esque fantasy world, or not Tolkien-esque, but with a shared mythology, and they wrote these little short stories and poems and stuff based in this fantasy world as they were growing up. And you can find them, I believe. It was their first writing that they did, sort of fairyland stories. And this is kind of an adult woman's version of that, I think. It's about real people in her real time and real human problems, but it's still in it's got the structure of that fantasy, because she could have easily made it about the real Brussels, but she chose to make it a fictional city and a fictional town, and there's, like I said, there's elements of ghosts possibly hanging around, or maybe it's her imagination, or maybe it's just her fancy, as they would say at the time, because it's written more or less like a diary of her time abroad. And I really liked it. I really liked it a lot. It comes in about 700 pages, I think. It did not feel like it at all. There was a big gap because uh, there is just kind of a time jump in the beginning, which is a convenient place to stop reading. So it did take me a while. I didn't get back to it because of other things. So that's the end of my reading of the Bronte sisters. I've read all their work now, and I've read one contemporary biography written by her friend, the other Elizabeth Gaskell, the other Victorian novelist, wrote a biography of Charlotte Bronte, which is not that deep. It covers the facts and everything, but there's a big one, I think, written maybe about a decade ago. Having a hard time finding it though. Maybe I'll order it when I get someplace where I can order easily, if I get a permanent apartment or something someplace. But and it's about 11. Oh, I just said that. I think it's about 1,100 pages, but who knows? It's probably 350 pages of notes. It's a um, it's a biography of all three sisters, and I'm interested in like biographies right now of writers, and also interesting, weird families of creative people. I've got a list going on that. Maybe we'll get to that later, but this is long enough. Anyway, I read Villette. I finished Villette. I finally finished the book I started for Victober. And then we'll see what's next. I got more stuff to read, so I'll get started on that. Talk to you later.